Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to go through a list of some adult fantasy standalones. I've done a number of these videos in the past, so if you are looking for more standalones after watching this, I'll have those videos linked. But jumping right into it, the first one I'm going to start with is Emperor's Soul by Brandon Sanderson. You can find it within the Arcanum Unbounded, as it is a novella, and so you're going to find a lot of the lesser known or less often read Cosmere works within this, but you can buy it on its own as well. So Emperor's Soul, if you don't really know a whole lot about it, you are following a young woman who has been captured and imprisoned, and she's looking at facing her execution. However, the people that would be in charge of executing her decide to instead take advantage of the very skills that landed her in prison in the first place. And she very quickly gathers that even though they've made this deal with her, where if she plays along with their plans, she doesn't really think that they're going to let her go and that they're going to honor their side of the deal. So the whole time she is trying to do what she can to figure out a means of escape, while also trying to accomplish what is basically the impossible. She is assigned with using magic to create a replica of an emperor, because this emperor was injured to a point where his physical body is able to continue on. However, he doesn't really seem to have a lot of brain function otherwise, and so they're wanting to ensure that they can have somebody create this replica of his soul to continue to pass as the emperor, as they don't want the entire realm to basically turn into chaos. So you do see this character having to try and accomplish the impossible from her prison cell. Basically, she's given very little room to work, and it's really interesting to learn about this magic. It is one of the most interesting magic systems in the Cosmere, in my opinion. It feels in some ways like every other Cosmere magic system combined. That said, if you have not dived into the Cosmere just yet and you're a little intimidated, this is going to stand on its own just fine. You don't have to have read the other stories, and if you are a fan of the Cosmere and haven't yet picked up Emperor's Soul, I highly recommend you do, because it's quite an experience. After that, we have one that, for the most part, I would categorize this as science fiction post-apocalyptic. However, there are some fantasy elements woven in. I can't give too many details as to how, because I think that kind of ruins the experience, but that would be the book Clean Air. If you don't know, I recommend books whether I loved them or not, just because I know everybody has different tastes, and this is one that I was by no means upset that I read it, but I also can't necessarily say I loved it. However, it was really interesting, and it was kind of an experience to read. So the setup for Clean Air is that we have had this apocalyptic-like event where the pollen has made it so that just breathing in normal air is impossible. You will die very quickly. The world has just immediately become uninhabitable. And so you're following a woman who previously lived in our world, you could say, as far as our technology, the time period that we're all used to, all those things she had, and then the world got flipped upside down when this natural disaster, you could call it, occurred. And so now she is dealing with the trauma of having all of these memories of what life used to be, trying to survive now within these domes that people live in, and it's sort of like it's like we're pretending at life. And she has a daughter, and she just doesn't quite know how she's ever going to explain what her life was like to her daughter, who only has ever known life within these domes. So it's very interesting just in that setup alone, but then mixed in with that is a serial killer murder mystery. So it's got a whole lot of different ingredients baked together, and then like I said, you will have a tiny, tiny sprinkle of something fantastical within that. It's an experience, like I said, so give it a try if it sounds interesting to you. I definitely haven't really read too many things like it, and I think post-apocalyptic can feel very been there, done that, anything new within this subgenre, but I actually do think that this one did establish itself as unique. After that, we have The Salt Grows Heavy. This is a novella, fairy tale, grim story that follows a mermaid and a witch doctor, and they happen to come across what is basically a cult that is taking advantage of the loyalty and the faith of these young children, and there's a lot of body horror within this story, so it's very, very disturbing. There's not a whole lot else I can say without just spoiling the whole thing, but there's a lot of commentary on the various different themes that we've seen in stories before, and how those themes, you can re-examine them when you look through a more modern lens. And I know sometimes we actually try to stray away from doing that. We try to see stories for what they were, and then sometimes we can be irritated when people take a modern view onto it. But this story is inviting you to do that very thing. It's inviting you to reflect on the stories we've seen before, the kind of classic fairy tales, and then look at them through, like I said, a more modern lens, but also with a horror element woven in. The writing in this one is pretty dense. If you're a fan of really, really beautiful writing, then I would definitely recommend this one. I know for some people, though, the density of the writing actually turned them away from it. They didn't really like that about it. But if you're looking for a beautifully crafted, grim horror fantasy novella, then this one will definitely fit the bill. After that, we have what I think is a very, very underrated, underhyped book for this year, and that would be The Thorns Remain. Speaking of themes, this to me is very thematic. It pulls from a lot of what we've seen in fantasy over the last few years. You see it having a lot of fae. The fae are much more sinister than what you find in a lot of modern fae stories, but it is pulling from a lot of the folklore surrounding fae. In the back of the book, there's actually a little bit of information about the origin of certain kinds of fae, and this kind of fae came from this country, and this is where this tale was the most prevalent, and it's really cool to see that. But it's woven into the story as well, and like I said, the fae are terrifying, they're horrible, but they're also tricksters, and they also are very captivated by human existence. And our main character, Mora Jean, is somebody who is grieving. She lives a very difficult life. This is also historical fiction fantasy, so you're seeing her having to deal with the loss of a loved one after a war, and then also after an illness that killed a lot of people after the war. And so she's not only mourning the loss of a loved one, but the loss of the life that she thought she was going to have. And within all of that, her friends have been taken by the Fae, and she is the only one in the village who knows the truth. Everybody else has had their minds warped to believe that all of these young people have been gone for months. And so she's trying to figure out a way to make a deal with the Fae to get her friends back. It is a little bit slower going. It's kind of day to day. You're literally following her from one day to the next. She's got to still do her chores and still live her everyday life because it's a rural village with a lot of intense labor. But I just thought that that really grounded the story. It immersed me in that time period, and I thought the themes were done exceptionally well. It is slow, though. I really want to emphasize it's quite slow. After that, we have Untethered Sky by Fonda Lee. I really liked this one. Every time I've brought it up, I describe it as very cinematic because the whole reading experience, it felt like I was watching a movie. I thought Fonda Lee was able to create the imagery exceptionally well. The setup is that we follow a young woman, and when she was young, something happened to some people that she cared about as a result of a manticore attack. The only means of going up against manticores are people that hunt with these giant falcon-like beings known as rocks. And so we follow this main character as she grows up and is desiring to become a hunter herself and bond one of these rocks, and then she can now protect people from the manticores. That's pretty much it for the setup, and I really enjoyed it. I really also want this to be almost like it wouldn't technically be a prequel because it's already written, but if Fonda Lee were ever to write a series within this world, this would feel like the origin, it would feel like lore within the same world. So I hope she writes more in it. But even if she doesn't, I just enjoyed the story for what it was. And I think if you're looking for just a quick, very captivating story, and like I said, feels like you're watching a movie, then I would definitely highly recommend this one. After that, we have another one that wasn't really for me, but a lot of people really love it, and that would be One for My Enemy. This is a Romeo and Juliet and West Side Story retelling that follows two rival families of witches. About a third to halfway through the story, you actually see it take a little bit of a turn and it becomes much more about the scheming within the families and a little less Romeo-Juliet. So I actually did like that portion of the story a lot more. I'm just really not a fan of that general setup. So it was never going to be one that I loved. I do think, though, that if you like writing that borders a little bit on the dramatic side, that it is melodramatic, that the characters are very extreme and just so passionate all the time, that's this book. Everybody is quite over the top with their emotions, what they have to say to each other, and it's like, oh my gosh, the stars in the sky when I see you, and they're just so over the top, and it's kind of fun sometimes to read stories like that, and I do like this author's writing quite a bit. So if you think that a West Side Story, rival families, some of the characters find love within all the hatred, then this one's definitely gonna be your cup of tea. Last, we started with the Sanderson, so we're gonna end with the Sanderson, and we have Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. I loved this so much. I think this has been my favorite. Well, I know this has been my favorite of Sanderson's secret projects. We follow these two different characters that seem to live on very different worlds, or at least very different places. One of them lives in what feels like a modern Tokyo, but modern Tokyo at night. It seems like night is just ever present and never really leaves, but you have a lot of modern advancements and a lot of things that we would consider to be luxuries typically in a fantasy world. Our character lives in an apartment, he has a shower, but the fantasy element that comes into the picture, besides just it being night feeling all the time, is that there are these beings known as nightmares. They're sort of like these incorporeal spirits that come into the city and then feed off of people's nightmares, and every time they do this, they form a little bit more. They become a little bit more physical. And so painters, their job is to paint something that then pulls the nightmare into the painting. And that is where you see the magic in one of our perspectives. And then the other character is in this desert-like place where plants are kind of floating, and the only means of any kind of convenience come through the wishes granted by these spirits. And the only way that you can attract the spirits is you have some beings that have the ability to use art, a very different kind of art than what you see in the other perspective. And they use their art to attract the attention of the spirits, and then they, on behalf of citizens, will request these conveniences for everyday life. And these two characters end up kind of sort of swapping places, you could say, and also tagging along with each other, and they go back and forth between each other's worlds, and they're trying to figure out what's going on and how is this happening and where even are you. And so you see the two of them trying to figure this mystery out while also getting to know each other in the process. I loved it so much. It was sweet, it was cozy, it was lovely, it was cool. There's just so many things about Yumi that I absolutely loved. I do think, though, while this is technically adult fantasy, I think this feels very young adult. So of all the ones on the list, this one's gonna feel probably the most youthful. That's it, though, for some adult fantasy standalones. Like I said at the beginning, I've done this video many a time and always with different recommendations. So if you would like some more recommendations, I'll have those linked. If you have any of your own recommendations, don't worry about if you've not seen those other videos. Feel free to mention other standalones that you really love. That way anybody that comes to this video, if they don't get the chance to look at other videos, they can still see your recommendations. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.